Good. So welcome, everyone. My name is Logan Willett, and I'm the community engagement lead here at CodeControl. So thank you so much for taking the time to join us today for our next virtual lunch and learn. This particular topic of freelance pricing, I think, is one that everyone as a freelancer, whether new or old hat, can gain some insights on and maybe can learn something new. It's one of the most requested, I think, topics that we've had in our CodeControl community. And so we're very, very happy to be finally tackling this topic today. So just to give you an idea of how how the event will run today. So we'll start with a brief introduction to CodeControl for those who aren't familiar. And then I'll talk a little bit about how the Q&A will go on Slido and how you can join. Then we'll start with a brief moderated discussion between myself and our guest. And then we'll spend the majority of the time, of course, on the audience Q&A, which is what I'm sure you all have come here for. And then we'll close off with some quick closing remarks near the end. Good. So for those who aren't familiar, CodeControl is a curated freelancer marketplace that is made up of some of the best tech talents all across Europe. Of course, there's a number of CodeControl members here in the call today. So we were founded in 2016 as a remote first company. At the moment, we have over 750 top vetted talents in the fields of software development, product management, UI UX design, as well as some emerging profiles like data science. And we've worked on hundreds of different projects together with clients ranging from startups up to corporates like Lufthansa, Siemens, and Visa for projects short and long over the last several years. And for those that might be interested, we have a really great product coming up called 9 a.m. I won't dive too deeply into that, but if you're curious, you can already check it out at 9am.work. Great. So, so we'll be using the Slido today for the audience Q&A. So if you'd like, you can already take a second to take out your phone and use the QR code to start adding your questions. I've added the link here in the chat as well. So you can already go onto the Slido and ask your questions. Yeah, and if you don't have any specific questions that you want to ask, but you see some questions in there that are really interesting for you, then of course feel free to use the upvoting feature so that we can ensure that those questions get asked. Good. Next, I'm very happy today. Oh, keeps changing on me. I'm very happy today to welcome our guest, Dave Smyth. So Dave Smyth is a web designer and developer who's based in the UK. He's the founder of Scruple Studio, a small agency producing work that benefits the world. And in 2019, Dave founded WorkNotes, which is this really great resource and community for freelancers. He also created No to Spy Pixels campaign, which is about raising awareness for tracking pixels embedded in our emails. And today, I'm very happy to welcome him to share some insights on his freelance pricing guide, created with the aim to help freelancers new and old understand how to calculate a rate that works for them, or rather for you, for those of you who have joined us for today. Great. So with that said, I would like to welcome Dave to the stage. Dave, welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me. Hi, everyone.
Good. Yeah, so maybe to start off, actually, this isn't a question that we'd asked about before, but I'm curious to know how did you first how did this idea for the freelancing pricing guide first come about for you?
That's a really good question. I think I wrote it in January 2019, something around that time, or no, January 2020. WorkNotes started in January 2019, and there was a bit of a community that started around that. And I was part of lots of communities for freelancers, and so this was a topic that came up a lot. And there's so much confusing advice when you're, particularly when you're starting out, like, do you value price? Do you price by the hour? Do you price by the project? Do you price by all these sorts of questions? And I just tried to distill like some of the things that I'd learnt and picked up and read about and come up with an approach that can work for people and lets people set a minimum rate that works for them, and then then they can scale it as much as they want above that later.
Very good, thank you. Great, and so we'll start off with a kind of maybe fact or fiction question. There's a lot of people that are attracted to freelancing as opposed to working regularly employed because of this idea that you can make a lot more money. In fact, in many past interviews I've had with a Townside Joiner community, one of the reasons that they said they wanted to go into freelancing was because they had a lot more flexibility, a lot more control over the work, but it often came up as well that they wanted to make more money. So for those maybe who are considering this move from regularly employed to freelancing, what do you think are some important factors to consider when they're making this transition?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I think it partly depends on your sector, like the money thing. Not just the sector that you work in, but also the job that you do. In the UK, actually, there's a stat that's something like the average self-employed income is something like £17,000, which is below the average wage here. So obviously that's a slightly distorted stat because there are people who aren't set up in the way that will be counted in that, but yeah, it really depends what you do. I think ultimately the answer is different for everybody. So it depends what you want from your work, what you want from freelancing, and there are ups or downs for every freelancer. So I think it's about making sure that the ups and the reasons you want to do it balance out any of the downs. So for me, I've been freelancing in some form or another for as a designer for about 8 years, and the things that I really like about it are those things that you mentioned just now, actually, like the flexibility. I've got a 2-year-old, and being able to be around for him and be flexible with the schedule and thing. I can't really put a price on that, but also having control of the work that I do, and that's something that the more I'm freelance, the more sort of picky I'm becoming, and the harder it would be for me to consider in going to work for a company. So yeah, I think the answer is really different for everybody, but it's really important to think about the reasons why you want to do it, and how practical it is. There's a really good book by Mark Bolton, who's a typographer and designer, called Designing for the Web, that's free online, and he writes. There's a chapter in there where he talks about transitioning from being an employee to a freelancer, and he talks about how in the months leading up to going freelance, it's a really good idea to be basically working really, really hard, doing freelance jobs alongside the full-time career. And I think that's a really sensible way to approach switching into freelancing if you're already employed.
Okay, so kind of testing the waters a little bit, doing it on the side, and then seeing if it's actually viable to go full-time freelancing, I guess.
Yeah, and lots of freelancers talk about how building a runway or a buffer before you go freelance, and that's something that I didn't do. So I was a musician before I did this. So that's not a particularly great way to build a buffer. But the freelancers that I know and that I've seen in communities that have done this and have worked in agencies or had another job, and then they've taken the time to build a 6-month buffer or something like that. Sorry if you can hear that. We have built this outside. The freelancers I know who've done that, they've found that the transition has been much smoother, and it's allowed them the sort of freedom to build a business around in the way that they want, and not to have to spend the first 6 months or a year scrabbling around for taking any job just because they need the money. So I think that's a really sensible thing to do if you're in the position to be able to do it.
Great. Cool. So let's kind of bring it back to basics, especially in case if there's any relatively new freelancers in this call. What would you say are some of the essential building blocks for determining how to price your work, let's say, regardless of field or level of experience?
Yeah, this is a really good question. I think the first thing to do is to get a grasp of your expenses, or what your expenses are likely to be, and these fall into there are so many expenses that sort of come out of the woodwork, to use a really British phrase, like over time, that aren't always immediately apparent. So there are things to consider, like if you're working from home, like what the cost is of having having a room to work from at home if you don't have one, or like if you're renting an office or co-working, there'll be a cost associated with that. There's equipment, like obvious things are your computer or your laptop, or the things you actually need to do your work. But if you buy a really good quality desk, or like a standing desk, or a really good quality chair, these things are not cheap, even if you buy them secondhand. There are software subscriptions, accountancy fees, travel, marketing, insurance, contracts. Or in a way, once you've been up and running for a while, it becomes easier to see these because you can just look at your bank account. But there are lots of things to try and get ahead of and try and take note of. Mm-hmm. Another thing to do is to take note of how long things take. So if you don't track time for projects, start doing it immediately for like everything you do, even if it's just like a personal project. I think that's one of the hardest things to gauge when you're starting out, is like how long does things actually take. Like even if you've worked in an agency doing like the same role, there are so many other parts to it that you may not have had to take care of. Starting to track time is an incredibly important thing. Even if you don't charge by the hour, you have to have a fundamental idea of how long things take and how quickly you'll be able to complete different sorts of tasks. Another thing is like to think about how much time you actually have to work. Most or many freelancers I know only bill about 50% of their working time. Because the rest, it seems wild to think that you bill so little of your time, but admin, marketing, communication, trying to secure work, like sorting out contracts, like all these things really eat into the day. And even if they're not individually, like particularly time-consuming tasks, the cost of context switching, right, it really interrupts your workflow, and so that sort of all adds into the time, and then other things. I know we might cover these a bit later, but it's also, you also want to consider things like profit. Like you want your business to be profitable. Mm-hmm. They say you want to charge enough to stay in business. You might want to factor in like a 20 or 30% profit margin, or more possibly. You want to think about pensions, sick pay, holiday pay, savings, tax. There's a lot. I've just reeled off a whole load of words, but there's a lot to consider.
Right, because I guess it's like essentially, it's not just that you're spending 40 hours a week or however many hours a week you want to work actually working. It's like you're essentially running a business on the side, I guess, doing all of the taxes and all that other kind of stuff.
For sure, and I think one of the things you see freelancers complain about are jobs that come up where a company advertises a position, and they literally take they advertise a freelance position and they literally take a full-time salary, and then they just divide it by how many days there are. So you end up with hourly rates that are like £15 an hour or £20 an hour or something. But they've completely missed the point, and it's not really their problem. Like they don't need to be completely au fait with like how a freelancer might charge, but it doesn't really work like that because there's so many other things for freelancers to consider.
Right, of course. Great. So yeah, so we talked a little bit about the essential building blocks that you need, and you go into in depth on that with calculations and stuff in your guide. What I'm curious to know is what would your advice be for those who are trying to benchmark in their particular field? So let's say, for example, you're a web developer that has mainly been working all the time in a regularly employment, but you're looking to move into freelancing, but you want to kind of get to kind of have an idea of what are web developers, charging in my region, or how do I stay competitive? What kind of advice would you have for people that are looking to benchmark?
It's tricky, but I think like the first thing is to like see if you can find a community of like developers where you can chat about this stuff. I'm sorry, the builders have chosen this moment to get the grill out. It's been quiet all day. Yeah. But something to consider here is that everyone will charge differently, even if the result seems to be the same. And that's because everybody's processes are different. So I think it's not just about working out, knowing what other people charge. It's also about like understanding the process behind that as well. Because yeah, like I say, everybody has a different process, and that's one of the major contributing factors as to why people charge different rates. If one person is charging, I don't know, like $3,000 or $5,000 to put together like a templated site, that's a completely different thing to somebody to delivering a site for what might be the same client, where you're delivering something completely custom and bespoke to them, and there's like a whole UX process and all of this sort of thing. So so it's tricky. I think the main thing is to talk to people, but I've seen lots of surveys over the years for freelancers that try and like work out benchmarks, but it's so tricky to get anything practical out of that, because half the time you don't know if people are reporting their turnover or their profit, but then you also don't know like what even if you know things like the experience level of the freelancers that are being surveyed, you don't know what they're delivering or like what the process is. So yeah, the best thing to do is to find a community if you can, and try and find people to talk to, and yeah, see where there's alignment, see where there are things you do differently, and try and work something out from there.
Right. Yeah, because it's a bit of a wild west in terms of the kind of content you can find online. Like, what is a regular typical developer rate? Yeah. So yeah, that's really good advice. Yeah. Good. So what's kind of your opinion on some of these low barrier freelance platforms like Upwork and Fiverr? A lot of people might be looking at these kind of sites or these platforms to kind of test the waters. Do you think it's a good starting point for many freelancers, or what's your kind of opinion on these very low barrier entry ones?
So funnily enough, I actually used Upwork when I started transitioning from being a musician, and it actually worked really well for me. But that's not the case for lots of freelancers. But in my case, I was able to build like a decent hourly rate, use it to build a portfolio of clients, and also in the very, very early days, it also let me refine some skills, and like particularly with like client communication and things like that. But I'm not naive to the fact that there was some time and circumstance that played into that. Like if I was starting today, I'd expect the experience I'd have would be quite different. I think one of the upsides of those platforms is that they let people get started without having to worry about contracts or like invoicing, or like they take care of some of the administration things. But I know they have like a bad reputation because of like the sorts of clients that are on there. But my thought about that is that those clients actually exist in the real world too, but they're sort of brought to the surface on those platforms because it's so visible, and yeah. But I also think that lots of freelancers get caught out on those because largely because they start on those platforms like very early in their freelance careers. So when there are like sharp clients on there, that's when you're most vulnerable to being caught out. And you, as you get older, as you get more experience, you're able to control the process and like spot red flags a bit easier and possibly be a bit stricter with things as well. Ultimately, like I think people have to make a decision about this, but I think it's better to build a business that works around you and where you have a bit more control, and where whether that's like through like inbound leads or like using a platform where like clients are actually vetted a bit, which can be very useful, or whether it's like through word of mouth or like even cold pitching. And I know people are afraid of cold pitching. There's actually a really good course I've seen out there that's on ethical cold pitching, which takes like a completely different approach to just email blasts. But I know that for some freelancers, that's an incredibly successful route to building a sustainable business. So yeah, I think there are pluses and minuses to those things. But you know, everybody's mileage will vary.
Of course. Cool. So I can see we have quite a number of questions coming in on the Slido. So maybe I'll ask one more question, then we'll go into the audience Q&A. From your experience, what are some of maybe the common pitfalls to avoid when pricing your work?
So yeah, I think one of the things is to make sure that you know what your like minimums are. So like what you need to make and how much you need to charge per hour to like make sure you hit what you need to survive. Going back to the idea of like dividing a salary by however many days in the year, I think lots of freelancers accidentally take that approach with their pricing and work out things that are prices that are based on them working like every single hour of like every single week. So I think that's something to be considerate of. I think also like not to get too hung up on the method of pricing initially, because you can charge hourly, you can charge a day rate, project rates, you can charge packages, value pricing, by commissions, or even like equity. But you have to be comfortable with the method of charging that you're using. I always felt like it was important for me to understand like how I'd come up with a rate as well.
Right.
So if that means that for you, you need to start charging hourly until you're comfortable with like your processes and how long everything takes, so be it. There isn't really a problem with that in my view. So yeah, I'm not sure if that answers your question, but I think those are some things to consider.
No, that's great, and I'm sure we'll touch on a lot of other points in the Q&A coming up. Good. So I do actually want to maybe start by giving the opportunity for anyone who is, of course, in the call. If you wanted to ask your question directly, you can feel free to unmute yourself and ask your question live. Yeah, so just feel free, anyone, if you'd like, you can go right ahead. We can start with that.
Okay, I'll jump in. Hi, Dave. My name's Carl. I was just wondering, I used to be on both sides of the freelance table, so hiring when I worked at a larger company, and now I'm a freelancer myself. I was just wondering, how much of a red flag is it when you get a more senior candidate, but he has a very low rate? And so this kind of ties into my question would be, for a candidate that does have seniority, how should they approach that?
Do you mean as the candidate, or do you mean as the
sorry, candidate, right? As the candidate, exactly.
So do you mean if a client so the client is approaching the freelancer, and the client is like a big client, and they're asking for a low rate? Is that what you mean?
No, I'm actually, so a client might have profiles from several candidates. And one of the candidates might have decidedly more experience, markedly more experience than the others, but still has a rate that's actually kind of low. I know what my thoughts of this on this have been in the past, but I was just kind of wondering what your thoughts would be. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, I think as a senior, as a more senior candidate, you kind of have your hands a little tied. I think because if your late is too low, it might send out, that might be a warning sign. And I guess I'm just kind of wondering what your thoughts on that might be.
Yeah, I think so. There's a phrase that, like, if you compete on price alone, you can never win. So there's always somebody cheaper, and I think that's always something to think about with a client as well. Like, if they're looking for price alone, then there are other things that we might be offering that they're not going to value. As for somebody who's senior, who's charging a lower rate, it's difficult to say. I've not been on this sort of hiring side particularly. So, yeah, it's a tricky one. I think you're probably right that more senior freelancers might be more have their hands tied, but then, you know, maybe they should be charging more because of the experience that they bring to it.
I think you answered my question. I guess what I'm taking from this is, since you have kind of a low level, you might actually just try to accentuate more of your meta competencies, as it's put, that you can also bring to the project. So I'm going to go with that. Okay.
I think there's so many things that we can that are valuable to us, that many of us have to offer, that we take for granted, that are incredibly valuable. And something I saw recently was talking about how all you need to worry about is whether, for that one client, whether the skills you bring are valuable to them. And it doesn't matter what other clients there are or what other people are competing for something. If you are the perfect client for that if you're the perfect freelancer for that client, then you might be way more valuable than we initially think.
Sounds good.
Great, thank you, Carl, for your question. Good, so let's go over to Slido. And we'll start with the first question at the top. So Dave, many clients base their budgets on the location where the freelancer is based. How should we address this?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. It's an interesting concept to me, that clients would have a preconceived idea of, like, looking for freelancers from specific locations. And I guess my answer would be similar actually to what we just talked about with Carl, that if we only compete on price, we can never win. And similarly, if a client, I'm making a big assumption here, but I'm assuming that this question is about clients looking for specific locations and looking to get like a lower rate. And I think that is a potential red flag for a client as well. Like, if they are only worried about price and not worried about other things that you can bring, like the quality of your work or any other specific skills or sort of value added things that you can bring to a project, then it might be that it's not a great fit, and it might be that they don't value some of the things that you can bring to the project, if all they're seeing is a number.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. Next question. If you work for a client long-term, when is the right time to talk about raising prices?
Oh, that is a great question. So I guess this is possibly about working in retainers, maybe. Mm-hmm. I think whenever you want to is the true answer. But practically, it can be hard to feel like any time is the right time. One technique that I've seen lots of freelancers deploy successfully is to say that every year they increase their rate, and they might say that they increase it by like a certain percentage, or they might say they might leave it vague and then increase their rates. So that can be a good way to make sure that your rate is always increasing in a small amount. So you might say it goes up like 5% a year or something like that. And clients will be used to the idea that things cost more as time goes by and the cost of living goes up. So that's a really understandable way of managing that with the clients. If you don't have something like that in place, I think I think like any time is a good time to do it. If like particularly if you're offering like a new service or you're offering a new something else, or if you're able to do things in a different way or offer new skills to them. But I think something to do that can sort of help that transition a bit is to give the client as much notice as you can. So you might say, in 2 months, my rates, or 3 months, my rates are going up to like X. And that's a way for them to get used to the idea, not feel like they've been forced into accepting it. The chances are that if you've got a good relationship and they value your work, they're going to keep you. And, you know, like as well, if you're not like 10xing your rate or something like that. So if the price increase is like reasonable and understandable, and you know, if you haven't, something I see quite often as well is freelancers who get into retainers when they're like just starting out, and then 5 years down the line they're still working with the same clients and they're still charging the same amount of money. And I think if you're in a situation like that, it can be useful to explain that your current clients you charge X to, and now you're going through a process of like bringing everybody, you know, they've been grandfathered into that rate for however many years, and they may not realize that, and you've kept them on that rate as long as you can, but now you need to bring everybody up to the same rate to be fair to the clients. Maybe you can give them a small discount for being with you for so long, or something like that, something that kind of sweetens it, shows you appreciate their repeat business. So there are lots of different ways you can do it, but I know that it's always a really hard conversation to have. But I think you just, again, it's another thing where you have to work out like what the best thing is for you and what you feel comfortable with, yeah, and then just do it. Yeah,
it's essentially about keeping good communication. I mean, especially if you've been with the client for 5 years, you must already have a good communication going. So yeah,
and you'll understand their business so well. And another thing, just quickly, I know there are other questions, but another thing to consider is how long, if you're nervous about doing this, how much time and effort would it take for the client to firstly find somebody else to do the job, and secondly, to get them up to speed so that they can just contact them in the way that they contact you right now and get the same level of work. It's an incredibly disruptive process, like finding somebody. So not that you're trying to like hamstring a client into just like accepting whatever terms you put on them, but if you think of it from their perspective, they probably value you in ways that you don't even realize. There's a lot of value in that.
Good, thank you. Question from David. What are the top 3 questions you are asking to filter clients? Let's say, I'm guessing that if you have like quite a pipeline coming in, how do you filter through those clients?
I actually ask many more than 3 questions, but one of the questions I ask that's a really good question is like, what would success look like in this project? And that's a really good way to get to the get an understanding of like the goals of like what they're that's a way of teasing out the goals for the project in a way that a client might not describe it if they're just writing a brief, because often when clients write briefs, they just tell you like, I want a website, I want 5 pages, I want the pages to be this, and a contact form and a carousel. But if you ask that question, that's I find that to be really helpful. Conversely, another question to ask is like, what might cause a project to fail? And that's it feels like it's asking the same question, but actually it's that can reveal some different things.
Right.
Another question is what is the motivator for doing the project like right now and not in like 2 years or something? That can introduce some interesting things. And if I'm allowed to squeeze a fourth one in, I actually always ask what their budget is. And the reason I tell the client about that, or the reason I tell them that we ask that, is so that we can make a budget specific recommendation. Right. Because, you know, if a client has like $10,000 to spend, you're going to give them a very different answer to something where if they come to you and say, I've got $2,000. Right. You can, so the solutions that you might propose would be different. And it's not about just like taking every single dollar. It's about like maximizing what you can deliver for their budget.
Right. So instead of kind of like leading with, you know, my rate is 150 euros per hour, or my retainer is, et cetera, it's kind of first getting them to demonstrate, okay, this is how much I have to work with, and then working within that kind of framework, I guess.
Yeah, and it's not even necessarily about like, if they say, you know, $20,000 that you charge them $19,999. It's just about it's like you said, it's just like getting a ballpark of like what they're expecting to spend, and that can give you an idea of the sort of appropriate routes you might take in the project.
Yeah, of course. Cool. Next question from Anonymous. Should we adjust our pricing in case the client is having financial issues? How should we handle requests for price decrease? I don't know if you've ever maybe experienced this in the past.
I've not had a case where the client's having financial issues, but I actually tend to charge 50% of the project up front, and then instead of charging 50% at the end, I charge like 40% in the middle of the project, and then 10% right at the end, which helps to prevent against this. It means that you're getting paid up front for like the main stages of the project. Right. And it also means that when the client takes 6 months to like produce the content, you're not like waiting 6 months for the final 50% of the project fee. I'm not sure about decreasing the price just if they're having financial issues. That's not really your problem. But there might be circumstances where you feel like you want to, but that's really like a personal thing. On the second question, how you handle requests for price decreases, if this is during the project scope, then I think one thing to do is to reduce the project scope in line with their like project in line with their like price requests. So if they say we only have, you know, $5,000 or something, and you've quoted for like 7,000, then reduce the scope to bring it in line with their budget. I think that's a really sensible way to handle that.
Of course, thank you. Good. So we do have quite some questions. So I just want to remind everyone, in case you don't want to ask questions, that's totally fine. But maybe you see a question in the Slido that is most interesting for you. So I just want to remind you that you can vote them up, and then they'll show up at the top of the feed, and then we'll start with those questions. So just a reminder that you can upvote the most useful questions for you. Good. So with that said, we'll go to the next one. I often read that hourly rates don't make sense and it's better to sell results. What's your opinion on this?
Yeah, I think that's a really common perception, and hourly rates. I wrote a little about this on WorkNotes, actually, not in the pricing guide. But hourly rates are seen to like punish freelancers for lots of reasons. Like if you're, it seems to like limit the value of the work or punish efficiency. It means you're only paid for the hours you work. And there might be like a glass ceiling as to like the limit of an hourly rate that you can charge. So I think that all of those things are like absolutely valid criticisms. But I also know of lots of freelancers who only charge hourly and absolutely make it work for them. Particularly, there's a freelancer I know who does very complex like back-end things, and charging hourly works for him because he's on a retainer with almost all his clients, and he sets like a minimum number of hours. Everything else that goes above those hours he charges at the end of the month. It means that every time beyond a consultation call, like a half-hour consultation call or something like that, beyond that, everything is charged. So if he has to produce a scope, if he has to produce however long it takes him to diagnose a problem, he's paid for every second that he works on it. Right. So I'm not of the view that it's like an absolute no-go. I think there are definitely situations where it can be an appropriate and profitable and sensible way to price work. But as I've said a lot, like this is just something that you have to like think about and think about the way you want to work. Lots of freelancers, like I tend to work on like project rates, and that can be, if you're comfortable with how long things take, and I think that can be that can be a way that works, and it's a way that works for lots of freelancers. So I think just spend some time like assessing things, like thinking about the type of work you do, how predictable it is in terms of like how long things take, and then make a decision based on that.
Thank you. How much of a red flag is it? How much of a red flag is a low rate for candidates that have that with seniority?
I think this was Carl's question.
Oh, was that your question, Carl? Oh, right. Yeah, you asked
yeah.
it live. Okay, perfect. So we can skip over that one. Good. Any tips on price discovery? I know in France, people will dismiss you for being too cheap, for example. That's interesting.
Yeah, I know this comes up with like value pricing sometimes, which isn't something I'm like an expert in at all. I know that something that comes up often is like, should you charge a client more just because they're a big client? And I think this is actually one of the reasons, or one of the justifications for doing that, is that some clients, if they're very, very big, will expect like a certain level, and anything that's under that, they might consider to be not worth. They might consider it to be like low quality, or
sure,
or not a big enough company, or something like that. So the only thing I can say is that what I said earlier, that I always ask the clients about like roughly what their budget expectations are, and sometimes clients won't want to reveal that, but I'm increasingly seeing that as a bit of a red flag, as because if they're not willing to discuss that, then you might be wasting everybody's time there.
Sure. So
again, like mileage will vary with that, depending on like the sector and your method of pricing and things. But I think if you can get comfortable like just asking that question, which can be a quite hard question to ask, then I think that can that can help.
Great, thank you. Next question. How do you protect yourself from frauds or runaway clients / freelancers, given that some freelancers / clients come from different countries? Good question.
Yeah, that is a good question. So the first thing is that I think all freelancers should use contracts. And one of the things that you'd want to have in your contract is a statement that the contract is a legal document in your country, which means that if you ever have to go to court or something, and thankfully I haven't had to do this, but I know people who have, then it makes it much easier to go through the legal proceedings, because you do it locally in laws that you understand, and in a court that's local to you. There's a web designer called Andy Clark who's written lots of books, and he's quite well known and produced the Contract Killer contract that he open sourced and lots of people use. And on a podcast, I heard him talk about how he once had a client in he's in the UK in Wales, and I think he had a client in Australia who reneged on their deal, and he actually hired a local debt collection firm into this client's town or city in Australia.
Wow.
Which he said he didn't enjoy doing, but funnily enough, the money turned up. And
Okay.
I thought that was actually a really smart way of dealing with that. But the other thing I'd say is that if you can, like, charge up front for each stage of work, if you're able to break the work down into stages, that's a really good way to protect yourself. So like I was talking about earlier, I charge 50% up front, 40% at a midway point, and then 10% at the end. And that means that by the time I start development, which is when I take the 40% payment, I already have 90% of the project fee. And that's a really practical way of reducing your exposure to somebody disappearing in the middle of the project.
Cool. I'm curious, have you ever had any kind of pushback from clients when you've kind of requested this method of payment, the 50% and the 40% and the 10, or are most clients happy to kind of go along with that method?
Once, but they came around to it. Ultimately, like, the biggest leap of faith is that initial 50%. Every other payment after that is smaller. And the other thing to remember is that after, so I do design, I basically do like whole projects. So I do like design and then development and then and then launch it. And after 50% of the work, once we start the development, and when I'm requesting the second 40%, they're already working with me. They already know, they already have a feel for working for me. They've seen some of the work. So the risk for them of the next 40% is much lower than the initial 50%. So I think if they're willing to commit to that first 50%,
that's a good sign.
It's a good sign, and it's actually not a huge hurdle to get them to the other 40%. But most of the clients, it's literally been, I started doing that 2 or 3 years ago, and I've only had one person like really question it, but even that ended up okay.
Great. No, that's a great method. Next question. How does a conversion funnel look for you? What is the rate from introduction to paying client?
I don't keep any stats like that, so I can't answer the question directly. But what I would say is that as I've gone further down my freelance journey, I've become more picky about the sorts of clients that I take on and the sort of arrangements. Or the sort of introduction. So I much prefer somebody to have come through our website, have seen the sort of work that we do, and then got in touch with us through that, than like the best situation if somebody is somebody's recommended us, then they've gone to our site, like read about us a little bit, and then come to us directly. We try not to do too much like cold pitching unless we feel like there's a really strong alignment there, and it tends to be more difficult if somebody comes directly to you. They've never seen any of your work or your site, and sometimes even referrals aren't always a great fit. It's really about finding alignment between what you offer, what the client wants. Yeah.
Cool.
So I can't answer that more directly.
No worries. No, but on that note, like you were talking about, you often prefer that they come from the website. I just wanted to plug that we did a really great lunch and learn with one of our community members, David Lerliette, last year. About creating kind of like this automated funnel using different kind of tools online to kind of automate this conversion process. So I invite everyone to check it out on our YouTube channel. Just look up CodeControl and you'll find it in the Lunch and Learn section. Good. So I think we kind of covered this one already about the runaway clients. Are there legal actions that can be done? I mean, you mentioned, for example, hiring the local debt collectors and including that paragraph in your contract. Are there any other methods that can be used in these kind of cases?
So something I introduced to my contract recently is like a pause clause. which basically says that if the client wants to pause the contract or the work, they can do it, but if they do it beyond, if they do like more than 30 days, it's considered to be, we'll have to reschedule the project and they're charged a fee. And if they pause it for like 60 days, it's considered to be a cancellation. And this isn't, the contract that we have is like really simple to understand. It's written in like super straightforward language. So it's not trying to catch clients out, but it's just trying to keep, excuse me, it's just trying to keep the project moving. And I think if you can do that, then it helps to reduce the chance of something like that happening.
Yeah, feel free to take if you need to take a drink of water, no worries. Good. So I think we have, I know we just answered this one. So we have one last question in the feed, and then I see we still have a few minutes. So in case there's anyone that maybe wants to ask any live questions, we can get to it after this question here. So any advice on how to determine a particular niche is for you? Any idea how to market your niche better?
Yeah, so when it comes to determining your niche, this is another thing where I think you have to decide what you want to do. So I know that some freelancers like go after a certain niche because there's money there. There's like a high turnover of like projects. And in some cases, lots of the projects will be very, very similar. So it makes it very easy for them to quote and they can sort of establish themselves as like an authority in that sector. The niche that we work in with Scruples has sort of evolved from our like personal interests about the web and how things are going on the web. So we've taken like a slightly different route there, but yeah, I think if you can. There's a really good Japanese diagram that I shamefully can't remember the name of, but where it talks about like these different areas, and if you can meet all of them, then you basically have like the combination of doing work that's rewarding, that pays you, and there are two other areas. I can't remember it enough, which makes it a terrible analogy.
No worries.
But I think you get the idea.
Ikigai? Is it Ikigai?
Yes, it is. It is.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dunya, for adding that in the chat. Ikigai.
Thank you. Yeah. That's exactly what I'm thinking of.
There we go.
And then, as for marketing to your niche better, there are lots of things there. So I think it depends how you're marketing already. So I know some people write newsletters as a way of like establishing their authority. I think content marketing generally is a really good way to do that, like teaching what you learn, showing that you know what you're doing and that you're not afraid to talk about it, but like there's no like secret sauce. Other people I know, other freelancers I know, like get really deep into like LinkedIn and things, and or like Twitter, and find like communities in those spaces. So there are lots of different ways that you can handle that and sort of build your authority in a particular space.
Of course. Great, thank you. So I think we might have time for maybe one more live question in case there's anyone still in the call that would like to step in and ask. Just feel free to unmute yourself and ask away. No? Good. No, that's totally fine. In that case, we can end pretty much right on time. But before we do, yeah, Dave, I'd just like to give you the chance to, have any last words.
You brought up the WorkNotes pricing guide slide. So this guide goes into a bit more depth into what we've been talking about. It takes the approach of coming up with like a minimum rate that will be profitable for you, but and that considers like lots of things about how you work, how much you can work, saving, pensions, all of those sorts of things. So there's a discount for everybody who's on the call that's available until the end of next month. So if you write CodeControl at the discount at the checkout, sorry, that gives you 30% off the guide. So I hope that's useful.
Great, yeah, and Dave was kind enough to give me access, and I had the chance to read through it. And I can definitely say, if I was kind of starting freelancing tomorrow with this guide, I feel like I'd have a really, really great understanding of how to really get started and all the important factors to think about. So thank you so much, Dave, for that. Great. So for everyone in the call, thank you so much for joining us live today. The call has been recorded and it'll be posted on our YouTube channel probably later this week. I hope you take the chance to check out the pricing guide using the code, as Dave mentioned, for a 30% discount. And yeah, I just want to take this opportunity to thank you, Dave, for your time and for sharing your insights today. And hopefully we'll see you all next at our next upcoming Lunch and Learn.
Thanks for inviting me, and thanks everybody for the questions.
Great, cool. Well, everyone have a great Wednesday and have a great rest of your week. Take care.